I remember that night like it was yesterday. The moonlight spilled through the windows, casting long, pale streaks across the hardwood floor. The clock in the living room chimed softly, 11:30. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wide awake. David had said he'd be working late in his office, finishing up some important papers. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? After 30 years of marriage, you just trust. But something didn't feel right. I got up, threw on my robe, and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen, my throat dry. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. That's when I heard it, whispers. His voice, low and warm, the way it used to sound when we first fell in love. And then hers, Maria, the housekeeper I'd hired just 6 months ago to help me keep up with the chores. You're too much of a risk, David said, laughing quietly. You like the thrill, don't you? She teased, her voice soft and syrupy. I froze mid-step, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white. My stomach churned. But it wasn't disbelief that hit me. It was the sickening confirmation of a truth I'd been ignoring for weeks. I crept closer, the sound of their conversation growing sharper with each step. Through the crack of the kitchen door, I saw them. Maria was leaning back against the counter, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her body language effortlessly confident. David was smiling at her like she was the only thing in the room. I didn't need to see any more. But instead of storming in, I stayed where I was, watching as my world unraveled before me. The air felt thick, suffocating, yet my mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years. Don't bother explaining, I finally said as I stepped into the kitchen, my voice startlingly calm. David spun around, his face paling. Maria's hand flew off his arm as though burned. Claire, he began, but I cut him off. Save it. I've heard enough. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. David stammered something incoherent, but I didn't stick around to listen. I walked straight past them, upstairs to pack a bag. My hands trembled as I threw clothes into a suitcase. 30 years of marriage, gone in an instant. But I wasn't crying. No, something else was stirring inside me. Something unfamiliar, something liberating. I left that night. The air outside was cold, biting at my cheeks as I loaded my suitcase into the car. My fingers hovered over my phone as I debated calling my sister, but I decided against it. This was my battle, and I needed time to think. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring together like a hazy dream. Eventually, I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town. The room was nothing special, but it was clean and quiet, which was all I needed. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I called my lawyer. Divorce papers would be drawn up by the end of the week. But as I sat in that dingy motel room, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I started to piece together moments from the past. Small signs I'd ignored, tiny red flags that should have warned me. Like the time I found David's phone screen turned away every time I walked into a room, or how he suddenly started working late more often, claiming deadlines were piling up at the office. And then there was Maria. The way she always seemed to linger just a little too long in his presence, her laugh a little too loud at his jokes. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, assured me I had a strong case. But the more I learned, the deeper the betrayal cut. Bank statements revealed unexplained charges, dinners, hotel stays, and even jewelry I'd never seen. David had been funding his affair for months, possibly years. I confronted him during one of our required legal meetings. How long has it been going on? I asked, my voice steady but cold. David hesitated, his eyes darting away. It doesn't matter, he finally muttered. It matters to me. Fine, he snapped. A year, maybe longer. His admission was like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let him see me falter. You're despicable, I said, standing to leave. He didn't try to stop me. But the real twist came 2 weeks later, when Evelyn called me with unexpected news. Claire, "I've uncovered something unusual," she said, her tone cautious. "What is it?" "There's a second account in David's name. It's substantial, 6 figures, at least, and he's been making regular deposits from your joint funds for the past 5 years." I felt the blood drain from my face. 5 years? Are you saying he's been planning this? "It's possible," Evelyn replied. "But that's not the strangest part. The account isn't just for him. It's joint with Maria." The revelation hit me like a freight train. Not only had David betrayed me, but he'd been siphoning our savings to build a life with her. Fury bubbled inside me, sharper and more consuming than I'd ever felt. This wasn't just an affair. It was an elaborate, calculated betrayal, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Evelyn and I devised a plan. With the evidence in hand, we filed for a restraining order to freeze the joint account. As the weeks passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. David's late nights, Maria's sudden interest in learning how to manage the household budget. It was all connected. But then came the biggest bombshell of all, one that left me reeling. Evelyn found another name tied to the account. A name I recognized instantly. Mark, my ex-boyfriend from college. What the hell was going on? The story was far from over, and as the pieces continued to unravel, I realized I'd only scratched the surface of David's deceit. I didn't sleep much after Evelyn dropped that bombshell. The name Mark echoed in my mind like an alarm bell I couldn't silence. Mark had been my first love. Charming, ambitious, the kind of man who could convince you the moon was within reach. We'd been inseparable in college until his sudden and unexplained departure left me heartbroken. That was decades ago. What could he possibly have to do with David and Maria? The next morning, I met with Evelyn in her sleek downtown office. She slid a folder across the desk, her expression unreadable. "You're not going to like this," she warned. I opened the folder, my hands trembling. Inside were bank records, emails, and a photograph that made my stomach churn. It was Mark, older now but unmistakably him, sitting across a table from David in what appeared to be a cafe. Evelyn continued, "The joint account you discovered? Mark's been receiving payments from it. Regular, substantial amounts. This isn't just about an affair, Claire. It's bigger than that. Bigger than that." I repeated the words in my head, trying to make sense of them. Why would David, my husband of 30 years, be paying my ex-boyfriend? And why was Maria involved? Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I believe this is part of a larger scheme. Mark and David seem to be in business together. Maria's role isn't entirely clear, but from what I've gathered, they've been funneling money into an offshore account. This isn't just infidelity, Claire. It's fraud. Fraud." The word sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, my personal heartbreak was tangled in something far darker and more insidious. "I need to confront him," I said, my voice firm. Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet. We need more evidence. If you tip him off now, he could bury everything, and you'll be left with nothing." I nodded reluctantly, knowing she was right. But patience had never been my strong suit, and this new revelation had lit a fire inside me. I couldn't just sit back and wait. That evening, I drove by the house, my house. It still felt like mine, even though I'd moved out weeks ago. The lights were on, and through the window, I saw David and Maria sitting at the dining table. It was surreal, like watching strangers in a life I used to belong to. I parked a block away and waited. At midnight, Maria left, slipping out the side door with a bag slung over her shoulder. My heart pounded as I followed her, keeping a safe distance. She walked briskly down the street, turning into an alley that led to a dimly lit parking lot. She climbed into a car, a sleek black sedan, and drove off. I tailed her for 20 minutes until she pulled into the driveway of a modest suburban home. She parked and went inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. I waited, debating my next move. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I crept toward the house, staying in the shadows. From my hiding spot near the window, I could see into the living room. Maria was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear. "You need to calm down," she said, her voice sharp. "We can't afford any mistakes right now. If she finds out, it's over." She paused, listening to the person on the other end. "I told you." David's handling it. "Just stick to the plan, Mark." Mark. Hearing his name made my blood run cold. What plan? And how deep did this conspiracy go? I pulled out my phone and began recording, capturing every word. Maria hung up moments later and poured herself a glass of wine, her expression tense. I slipped away before she could notice me, my mind racing. The next day, I met Evelyn again and showed her the footage. She watched intently, her brow furrowing. "This changes things," she said. "If we can tie Mark to this operation, we'll have leverage. But we need to move quickly." As Evelyn worked her legal magic, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I tracked down Mark's office address from an old friend who still kept tabs on our college circle. It was in a nondescript building downtown, tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. When I arrived, I was surprised to find the door unlocked. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding. The office was small and cluttered, with papers strewn across the desk and a faint smell of stale coffee in the air. On the wall was a corkboard covered in photographs, receipts, and notes scribbled in red ink. My stomach tightened as I recognized some of the faces: David, Maria, and even me. One photo stood out, a candid shot of me and David at a charity gala last year. My smile looked forced, as if some part of me had known even then that something wasn't right. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note: Phase 3, final payout. Before I could process what it meant, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic surged through me. I ducked behind the desk just as the door creaked open. "Mark, we need to talk," a familiar voice said. It was David. Mark's reply was curt. "You shouldn't be here. It's too risky." "I don't have a choice," David snapped. "Claire's digging, and Evelyn's too good to underestimate. We need to shut this down now." I held my breath, straining to hear every word. Mark sighed. "Relax. She doesn't have enough to take us down. Yet. Just stick to the plan and keep her off my trail." Their conversation continued, but I couldn't focus. My mind was spinning, trying to piece together the puzzle. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't just about money. It was personal. As they left the office, I waited until their footsteps faded before slipping out the back door. My hands were shaking as I called Evelyn, recounting everything I'd overheard. "This is bigger than we thought," she said grimly. "If they're targeting you specifically, we need to act fast. Meet me at my office first thing tomorrow." That night, I couldn't sleep. The words Phase 3 echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of impending doom. Whatever David and Mark were planning, it wasn't over yet. And somehow, I was at the center of it all. The following morning, I arrived at Evelyn's office feeling like a storm was brewing inside me. I wasn't sure if it was anger, fear, or some volatile mix of the two. Evelyn was waiting with an urgency in her demeanor I hadn't seen before. "Claire," she began, sliding a new file across the desk. "You need to see this." Inside were documents she had unearthed overnight. Financial records, property deeds, and a damning email chain between Mark, David, and Maria. The emails outlined a detailed plan to liquidate my assets, divert money into their offshore accounts, and leave me financially ruined. But what truly shook me was a name buried in the correspondence. The family trust my parents had left me after their passing. They weren't just targeting my savings. They were going after my legacy. "This has been in the works for years," Evelyn said, her voice tight. "They've been systematically siphoning funds and setting up contingencies in case they got caught. Phase 3, as you overheard, is the final step. They're planning to transfer everything into a shell company under Maria's name and disappear." "Disappear?" My voice was a whisper. Evelyn nodded. "Once the money is gone, they'll be untouchable. We have to stop them before they can execute it." My mind reeled. 30 years of marriage, and the man I thought I knew was capable of something this monstrous. But I wasn't just a victim in this story. I refused to be. "What do we do?" I asked, my resolve hardening. Evelyn smiled faintly. "We fight fire with fire." The plan was risky but necessary. Evelyn used the evidence I had gathered to freeze David's accounts and subpoena the offshore records. But that was just the beginning. To lure them into making a mistake, we needed to make them believe I was giving up, that I'd been blindsided and was retreating. I moved back into the house temporarily under the pretense of reconciliation. The thought of sharing space with David was nauseating, but I swallowed my disgust for the sake of the plan. Maria, ever the opportunist, seemed to relish her visits to the house, flaunting her presence like a badge of victory. "You're taking this well," she smirked one evening when David stepped out to make a call. "Life's too short for bitterness," I replied, forcing a smile. Inside, I burned with rage, but her arrogance played right into our hands. The more comfortable they became, the sloppier they got. The breakthrough came a week later. Evelyn and her team intercepted a wire transfer David had initiated to the offshore account. It was flagged immediately, and within hours, law enforcement was involved. The dominoes began to fall rapidly, but there was still one final twist. That evening, David came home visibly agitated. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tense. I followed him to the kitchen, where he poured himself a drink. "Something's wrong," he admitted, staring into his glass. "The accounts are frozen, and Evelyn's onto us." I didn't think she'd dig this deep. Us. That word hung in the air. "David," I said calmly, "why don't you tell me the whole story?" He froze, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "You've been lying to me for years," I said, my voice steady. "About Maria, about the money, about Mark. I know everything." David's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I slid a folder across the counter, the same one Evelyn had shown me. "Go ahead. Open it." He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. As he flipped through the pages, his hands began to tremble. This is all circumstantial," he stammered. "You can't prove anything?" "Oh, but I can," I said, stepping closer. "The wire transfer? It's already been flagged. The offshore account? Frozen. And Mark? Well, let's just say he's not as loyal as you think." David's eyes widened. "What did you do?" "I gave him a choice," I said with a smirk. "He could go down with you, or he could cut a deal. Guess which one he picked." David's composure shattered. He slammed his glass onto the counter, the liquid sloshing over the edge. "You have no idea what you've done." "Oh, I think I do," I replied coolly. Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. 2 officers stepped inside, their expressions grim. "David Reynolds?" one of them asked. David glared at me as they read him his rights, his face a mix of fury and defeat. "You'll regret this," he spat as they led him away. "I already did," I murmured as the door closed behind them. Maria was next. She was arrested at her apartment that same night, screaming about how it was all David's fault. As for Mark, his cooperation earned him a reduced sentence, but his reputation was ruined. In the weeks that followed, the tangled web they'd woven unraveled completely. Evelyn ensured I regained control of my finances, and the court awarded me full restitution. But the most significant victory wasn't the money, it was the freedom. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. On a sunny morning 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, the windows open to let in the breeze. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined me. I had rediscovered something David had tried to take from me, my strength. As I sipped my coffee, the doorbell rang. It was Evelyn, carrying a bottle of champagne. "To new beginnings," she said, smiling. "To freedom," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. And for the first time in a long time, I truly felt free.